For those of us who live and work here in city center, the challenge and the question of homelessness and the homeless, and especially those who ask us regularly for change and money and things, it's hard to deal with. It's hard to know what to do, what the right response is. I must admit, I do know that I am my mother's son. My mother herself, who was the daughter of what was then affectionately known a hobo, but a homeless person, dealt with in her own life the difficulty of growing up poor and growing up in some degree of need and struggling herself with the reality of her father. But there was a time when my parents from Massachusetts met my mother's brother and his wife from Florida at Atlantic City to go to a casino. They had just left a casino. What do you do at a casino? You take your money and you give it to someone else, thinking you're playing a game. But they have just spent a lot of money. And on the way out, right in front of the door, as we're used to ourselves, was a man with a little cup and asked them for money. And my mother, sweet, kind woman that she was, turned and spat at the man, "Get a job." And her brother started roaring, laughing. He said, "Wow, after all these years, you're still not over Dad." But it is a complicated scenario. And we do know this, that Jesus tells us today in our gospel that when you have a party, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and that they cannot repay you back means that you're fortunate, because repayment will be made to you when the virtuous rise again. Jesus gives us this injunction as a remedy for pride. It's a practice of humility, humility which ties us in its very root to the earth, to be grounded, and in that sense to know who we are. Our first reading from Ecclesiasticus reminds us that there is no cure for the proud man's malady. An evil growth has taken root in him. He reminds us that the greater we are, the more we should behave humbly, and that we will find favor with the Lord that way. For great though the power of God is, he accepts the homage of the truly humble. When I was first starting in religious life, as a means to check our pride and perhaps to enter more fully into a sense of humility, we were taught, and I probably have mentioned this before, we were taught the concept of the sin of singularity, trying to stand out in our holiness. Those little acts that broadcast to those around us that we're holy, at least holier than them. That we're generous, more generous than the others. That we're forgiving, more forgiving than those around us. That we live more simply than them. This is not the case of giving good example, but a prideful proclamation of our own worthiness, our own goodness, for all the world to see, and it's cloaked in little gestures of piety and holiness. And the number one thing we were trained to do was to root out the sin of singularity in our hearts, to stand out above and different. One commentator, Eleanor Stumpf, on this week's gospel, spoke of 4 different manifestations of human pride. The first one we know fairly well, childish pride, the just braggadociousness of somebody who's telling everyone how good they are or how well they've done. And then there's the more adult manifestation of childish pride. It's the manifestation of the self-made man or woman. The person who no longer recognizes, cannot see that all the good they have, all of the grace they've received is from God. And they've done nothing. What comes next is a more complicated Christian pride. This kind of pride recognizes that all the gifts a person has received are from the grace of God. But again, unlike our worldly brothers and sisters, we are going to make good use of them. She calls this one the Christian prig, the one who does nothing wrong, flaunts it, and looks down on others. Then she articulates the worst kind of Christian pride, in some ways the most sophisticated. This person recognizes all the gifts he or she has received and possesses are from the grace of God. But he or she is glad that they have received them, and happy that his or her neighbor has not. What then is humility? For Stump, it is recognizing that every good we have received is a gift from the grace of God, meant to be given back to God by being shared with those around us. We are to will their well-being, their ongoing conversion, to pray for them even when we struggle to like them, and truly hope that they come to know and experience the fullness of God's love, are transformed by it, and respond fully in kind. We are to love them. It's having a party and inviting the poor, the crippled, and spending your fortune, simply the gifts you've received from God, that they too may know the generous gifts of our loving Creator, and doing so without any prideful self-reference. This is something we're called to do as individuals, as a church, and as a society. St. John Paul II wrote in Santissimus Annus in 1991, "It is not merely a matter of giving from one's surplus, but of helping entire peoples, which are presently excluded or marginalized, to enter into the sphere of economic and human development. It is not enough to draw on the surplus goods, which in fact our world abundantly produces, goods that were given for all of us. It requires above all a change in our lifestyles, of models of production and consumption, and of the established structures of power which today govern societies." So when we look at the issue before us, when we look at the needs of others, when we do so with true humility and an understanding of the gifts we have received, whether we're looking at the person sitting in front of us with a cup, whether we're looking at the needs of a broader systemic issue in our society or across our world, those webs of power that keep people down, whatever we're looking at, we are to respond in some deep and meaningful way from the very core of our being, returning love for love, and being mindful that when we act, we do so merely as a response to the love we have received and not pridefully. When I was in a volunteer program just out of college, one of the things we were to do was to live simply. And sometimes people took that stricture as looking as if we were hurting in some way, to show the world how meaningful and powerful our witness was. And M.J. Murray, a woman just a year or two older than us who ran the program, simply said this: "Remember, never..."